Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a powerful idea from Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. We're going to see how a full-blown crisis, as terrible as it can be, might just be the one thing that can fix the broken, hidden rules that secretly run our workplaces. So let's start in a pretty intense place, an operating room at Rhode Island Hospital, which is, one of the best medical centers in the country. So you've got an 86-year-old man unconscious on the table. The situation's critical, yeah? But from a surgical standpoint, it's actually pretty straightforward. A scan has already shown what the problem is, a subdural hematoma. Basically, blood is pooling and putting pressure on his brain. The surgeon's job is clear. Drill a small hole, relieve that pressure, and save his life. So the surgeon makes the cut, drills through the bone, and looks inside for that dangerous pool of blood. But there's nothing. The brain tissue looks perfectly healthy. The hematoma he was expecting to see, it's just not there. Okay, just let that sink in. How on earth does a mistake this huge happen, especially at a top-tier hospital with an experienced surgeon? Well, the answer isn't about one bad doctor. It's about the invisible habits, the unwritten rules that were running the show behind the scenes. To really get what went wrong, we have to look past the people in the room and see the invisible architecture of the hospital itself. And this is where a fascinating theory from two economists, Nielsen and Winter, comes into play. They basically argued that companies are not at all what we think they are. So you can forget that idea that workplaces are big, happy families all pulling in the same direction. Nelson and Winter said nope. They're much more like battlefields in a constant, low-grade civil war. You've got departments, teams, and individuals all jockeying for power, for resources, for credit. So what keeps the whole thing from just exploding? Well, two things: routines and truces. These routines are basically the hundreds of unwritten habits that let people get their work done without having to fight over every little thing. And these routines, they create truces. Think of them like delicate, unspoken peace treaties between all those competing groups. They let everyone set aside their rivalries so they can actually, do their jobs. But what happens when those peace treaties are completely unbalanced? Well, at Rhode Island Hospital, the truce was totally one-sided. The doctors held all the power, and the nurses were the only ones making concessions. I mean, look at this. They developed these incredible secret habits just to survive. They were literally color-coding doctors on a whiteboard to warn each other. Blue for nice, red for a jerk, and black for do not contradict this person ever. They were the ones quietly double-checking sloppy work, and they were the ones who had to endure verbal abuse, all to keep this fragile peace. But at the end of the day, they had no real power. So let's go back to that operating room. A nurse notices the paperwork isn't quite right and suggests, hey, maybe we should check the scans again. And in that single moment, the whole fragile, unbalanced truce just shatters. The surgeon, who is often a black on that secret whiteboard, gets angry. And the deep-seated habit, the unwritten rule, takes over. The surgeon always wins. The safety procedure goes right out the window. So, an unbalanced truce is obviously a huge problem. But here's the kicker. Sometimes a perfectly balanced truce, where everyone just stays in their own little box, can be just as deadly. For this, we're going to jump over to London, 1987, at the King's Cross subway station. This timeline is just a terrifying look at how a tiny problem can snowball into a total catastrophe. See, back then, the London Underground was run by these fiercely independent departments. And the number one rule was, you do not step on another department's turf. Ever. And this perfectly balanced but dangerously siloed truce created this absolute cascade of fatal delays. This is really the dark side of a perfectly balanced truce. Each one of these routines made perfect sense in isolation. The ticketing clerk's job was only to sell tickets to keep the lines moving. Station staff were told not to call the fire brigade for small fires to avoid causing a panic. But the problem was, when you put all those sensible rules together, you get a system where no single person, no single department, was ultimately responsible for passenger safety. The whole thing was designed to fail, and it did. 31 people died. So here's the crucial point. Both the hospital and the subway were completely paralyzed by their own habits. They were stuck in these toxic patterns that had been designed by accident and fear. And they weren't going to change, not until something shattered the status quo. And that something was a public crisis. There's that famous saying from Rahm Emanuel, and it's so true. Smart leaders understand that a crisis makes an organization flexible. The old truces are broken, the old routines are suddenly up for debate. All those changes that seemed impossible yesterday, now they're not just possible, they're urgent necessities. Back at Rhode Island Hospital, the intense media scrutiny and public outrage became the catalyst. Instead of getting defensive, a few leaders there seized the moment. They pushed through reforms that doctors had blocked for years. They completely redesigned the hospital's habits from the ground up. And this number, that is the number of wrong site surgical errors at Rhode Island Hospital since these new habits were fully put into place. 0. It's powerful proof that a crisis, when you seize it, can lead to profound, lasting change. But really, the most important change wasn't a new rule or some new technology. It was the culture itself. The truce between doctors and nurses had been totally rewritten, and this one final story just shows it perfectly. So, a few years later, picture this. A 27-year-old nurse named Allison Ward is the most junior person in an OR. She's assisting a very experienced, highly respected surgeon. During the pre-op checklist, she notices he missed a small detail. Now, a few years earlier, saying something would have been career suicide. It would have violated that old broken truce. But she does it. She speaks up, she reminds him and the entire team of a crucial safety step. You can just imagine the tension in that room, everyone just holding their breath. The surgeon's response shows just how much everything has changed. And there it is. No anger, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement and respect. The truce had been rebalanced. The hospital's habits were no longer a product of accident and fear. They were now designed with a deliberate focus on teamwork and safety. And that leaves us with a really powerful question, doesn't it? Whether it's in our jobs or our own lives, crises feel destructive. But they're also these rare opportunities when things become flexible again, when we can actually redesign the habits and the truces that hold us back. The real key is learning to see them and then finding the courage to seize them.